Okay, we are starting Perek Chet today. Perek Chet was where we were up to before we had we had one class that we kind of shifted from Daniel to Pesach before Pesach itself. So we're going to make up that class, and it's sort of a transition between the previous unit, which was about Daniel and his experience in the Babylonian environment, both the stories related to his encounter with Nebuchadnezzar and with Belshazzar and the writing on the wall prophecy, as well as the one prophecy we read in chapter 7, which began at the beginning. I'm going to go back for 1 second, which began in the beginning of Perek Zayin, was Bishnat Achat LeBelshazzar Melech Bavel, the first year of Belshazzar, who was the third of the Babylonian kings, the third and the last in Tanakh. And Daniel had a vision, and we talked about that vision with the various animals, the 4 animals that arrived, that came out of the sea and what they represented, and various possible interpretations. I'm not going to rehash that for now. It is recorded and available online. But this is the next chapter, and it starts Bishnat Shalosh L'Malchut Belshazzar HaMelech. We're still in the time frame of Belshazzar. So even though I had indicated that our focus now is going to shift to the next era, which is Persia, we will, B'ezrat Hashem, in our next unit, next chapter, do so. But we'll already see that this kind of brings us into the domain of a discussion around Persia and how that Daniel's relationship with Persia as well. So I'm going to jump right in. Stop me if you have any questions, or if you are if something goes wrong with the tech. Again, if you are just joining us, here is the link to the sources, and there is also the text of the book itself. So there's 2 separate source pages we're going to be using. This is the text. Bishnat Shalosh L'Malchut Belshazzar. Now, one of the things, if you've been following along up until now, one of the things you'll notice right away is there's only 2 columns here, unlike the previous chapters, which had 3 columns. That's because Perek Chet is that moment in the book where the text itself shifts back from Aramaic to Hebrew. So we're now back into the original language of the text of the book, which is here till the end of the Sefer in Hebrew. I do not have a good explanation as to why some parts are in Aramaic and some parts are in Hebrew. I'm not going to venture into a guess because I just don't know. So that's as truthful and honest an answer I can give you. Bishnat Shalosh L'Malchut Belshazzar HaMelech, 3rd year of Belshazzar, which is the same year that Daniel was invited to Belshazzar's palace because Belshazzar saw that writing on the wall. That whole prophecy, that whole experience, writing on the wall and Daniel's explanation of it, Mini Tekel Ufarsin, that was all the same year. 3rd year Belshazzar, it's the final year of Belshazzar in Tanakh, and Daniel has a vision. Nira Elai Ani Daniel, Acharei Nira Elai Batchila. This is the continuation of a vision after what I saw initially. In other words, chapter 7, chapter 8. Chapter 7 was the beginning of Belshazzar, the 4 animals representing, as we interpreted it, 4 kings of the 3 kings of Babel and the king of Persia, or as the Mefarshim explained it, 4 kingdoms. That whole experience, this is the continuation of that vision. I was in Shushan, the capital, which is in the province of Elam. So Daniel is there out in Shushan. If you remember, everything else is happening in Babel. Daniel is out in Shushan. There is he's disconnected from the Babylonian kings, from Belshazzar. He has to be called back to Belshazzar's palace. And in this vision, he was standing at the stream, the river Ulai, and he sees the following. There was a ram by the stream, and this ram had 2 horns, kranayim, not karnayim, which be a plural, but kranayim meaning 2. Ve'akranayim gvohot, they were tall horns. Ve'achat gvoha min hashenit, one was higher than the other. Ve'hagvoha ola ba'achrona, the higher one came up last. Why that's relevant? as we see the interpretation, we'll see it's a little detail, but it happens to be accurate. I saw this ram goring, pushing north, west, north, south. And all of the beasts could not stand before it. And no one could deliver anyone from the hands of this beast. It did as it will, as it wanted, made itself exceedingly great, magnified. This ram was on a rampage and no one could stop it. And as I was considering, mevin, understanding, trying to understand and watch, behold, Sefer ha'izim, a he-goat, came from the west. It was covering the earth. It seemed to be going so fast and so quick that it didn't even touch the ground. It was hovering above the ground as if it was flying. And this Sefer, this goat, had one conspicuous horn between its eyes. Unlike the ram, which had two horns, this goat had a single horn. This goat came to this ram, and ran into it with all its fury. I saw it come to the ram, and it was bitter, it was sick. It smote the ram. And it smashed its two horns. The isle did not have the strength to stand before this goat that was flying through the air. It threw him to the ground. It trampled over him. No one could deliver the ram from the hands of this goat. And this goat was great, exceedingly, in its strength. At its height, at its heyday, at its moment of strength, this great horn broke, and in its place, came up four other horns, to the four corners of the earth. And out of these came one little horn, meaning the smallest of these four, or maybe an additional one, it's unclear. And it grew towards the south, the east, and the beautiful land, meaning referring to the land of Israel. It waxed great even up against the hosts of heaven. And it continued to challenge. It threw to the ground from the armies, from the hosts of the heavens and the stars, and trampled upon them. It magnified itself even against the prince of the host. And then the burnt offering was taken away. And the place of his sanctuary, his mikdash, was cast down. The host, the army, was given over to it with the burnt offering, through transgression, meaning the burnt offering was removed because of its transgression together with the army. Vatashlech emet arza. Truth was cast to the ground. And it brought, and it did, and it prospered, and it trampled, and it destroyed. Veshma echad kadosh midaber. And then I heard one of the holy ones referring to the Malachim. Daniel refers to angels as Kadoshim, speaking. And one said to another, how long will it be, this vision of the burnt offering being trampled upon? Tet v'kodesh tzava mirmas, and the burnt offering, the transgression, the sanctuary to be trampled underfoot. How long is this going to go on? Ad erev boker alpayim shloshim. He said, until morning, 2,300. And then v'nitzdak kodesh, then the sanctuary shall be victorious. That's the vision. And the vision itself stops here, and we could try to guess what it is referring to. But we don't really need to do too much guessing, because Daniel himself inquired. When I, Daniel, saw this vision, I sought to understand it. And standing near me was an appearance of a man, we'll see in a moment, referring to a malach. I heard the voice of a man by the banks of Ulai. I called out and said, Gabriel, which of course is a reference to the malach Gabriel. There are a number of malachim we have identified by name in Jewish tradition. One is Gabriel, and Gabriel is the only place in Tanakh where Gabriel is mentioned by name is here in Sefer Daniel. Every other reference is in rabbinic literature. We'll see another malach later on also mentioned by name, but those are the only two. Vayomar Gabriel, can you explain to me this vision? So he came near to me where I was standing. When he came, I trembled. I fell on my face. And he said to me, Haven ben Adam, understand this, son of man. This is a vision belonging to the end of time. When he spoke to me, I fell on my face. He touched me, he stood me up, gave me strength. He said to me, I am sharing with you what will be at the end of time of indignation, or the latter time of indignation. This is for the appointed time. So now we're going to figure it all out. He's going to tell us exactly what this vision represents. The two-horned ram. Who do you think the two-horned ram is? That's easy. Malchei Madayu Paras. Mede Persia united. Why two horns? Because, right, the two kingdoms. Persia is an alliance of two major peoples or nations. It's why it's sort of become the strong Persian Empire by the united front of Madai and Paras, Mede and Persia. Mede comes first historically, but Persia is much stronger, and hence the smaller horn first and then the larger horn behind it. We mentioned that earlier. And that Safira is Sa'ir, as for the Hikot, Melech Yavan. That's the king of Greece. So who is the king of Greece with one horn that beats Persia, that defeats Persia? That one should be easy. We don't want to venture a guess. Who is the king of Persia who defeats Persia? The king of Greece with a single horn that defeats Persia?
Alexander.
Alexander the Great, correct. That horn between its eyes, that is the first king. And then the story continues. It broke, vanishberet, referring to, we can already begin to guess where this is all going, referring to What happened? What does a horn breaking represent? Horn breaking usually represents
The end of
Reaching
the
kingdom.
end of the kingdom or the death of the king. In this case, the death of the king, the death of Alexander the Great in the year 323 BCE. We'll come to the history of it in a second. But Ta'amodna arba tachteha, and in its place arose four. We'll see what those four refer to. Arba malchuyot migoy ya'amodna velo bekocho. 4 kingdoms shall arise out of that one kingdom, but not with his power, much smaller and much less powerful. U'ba'acharit malchutam, and at the end of their kingdom, yohatem haposhim, when their transgressors have completed their transgression, yamod melech az panim umevin chidot. Shall arise a king of fierce countenance, an understanding strategy. This was the last little horn that came and waged war with the heavens. His power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. He shall destroy terribly, and shall do and be prosperous, and shall succeed, and he shall destroy mightily. The Am Kedoshim, he will destroy the people of the holy ones, meaning Am Yisrael, which is his reference to the Jewish people throughout the book. The Al Sichlo, and as for his cunning, Vitzliach Mirma Biado, and his cunning shall be, he shall cause craft to prosper. Ubilvavo Yagdil, and in his heart he shall make himself great. Ubishalva Yashchit Rabim, and in his security he shall destroy many. The Al Sar Sarim Ya'amod. He shall even stand up against the prince of princes, but he shall be broken without hand. And that's the conclusion of the story part of the vision, except we then have this conversation about the 2,300, that which was said about the vision evening and mornings, 2,300, emetu. It is true. However, v'yata stom hechazon. Seal it up, hide it, ki liyamim rabim, for it belongs to many years to come. Daniel was faint and sick for days from this vision. I came, I rose, I did with the king's business, and I was quiet about this vision and did not understand it. And that's the end of Parakhat. All right, so there are parts of this story that are very clear, and there are parts that are less so. So the parts that are very clear is that ultimately the main centerpiece of this vision is a story of two empires, namely the Isle and the Seir. You have the ram and the goat. The ram representing the two horns of Mede and Persia, Madayu Paras, and the goat, the single horn, representing the conquest of Persia by Alexander the Great. That part's easy. And the Mefarshim identify this almost unanimously across the board. The Sar, let's go down here. The breaking of the horn. Let's see what we can see. Let's look at it first, right? And then the most important part of it is that after this ram that will this goat that will come and destroy the ram, Keren B'Lasha Ben Enav Nishberet. That horn is broken, referring to the death of Alexander the Great. And in the aftermath of the death of Alexander the Great, what will emerge eventually are 4 kingdoms from it, but not with his strength. So this already is probably the most direct historical reference in this parak to what is he referring to. Who are these 4 kingdoms that will emerge from the death of Alexander the Great, but not with his strength and character? So if you look at the Mefarshim, almost unanimously, they all talk about the death of this of Alexander the Great will lead to Nechleka Malchuto L'Arba'a Melachim. Ibn Ezra writes, his kingdom will be divided up into 4 kingdoms, into 4 sub-kingdoms. Rashi similarly, Al Yedei Gdudav, no, sorry, that's the wrong Rashi, this one. ותעמודנה ארבע תחתיה, כמו שכתוב בספר החלום למעלה, ד' מלכויות אשר יעמודנה מאותו גוי, 4 kingdoms which will emerge, arise from that nation, שחילק אלכסנדרוס מוקדון מלכותו במותו לארבעה ילדים. For he divided his kingdom upon his death unto 4 youths, he calls them, assuming they're his children, which they are in fact not. However, he quotes the fact that he is aware that Yosef, referring to the Yosifun or Josephus, they were the heads of a leopard, and they were not his sons of the king. So before we get to the latter part of this kingdom, of this vision, and this part of it's easy. Right? To what is Daniel referring to when he talks about the breakdown of the death of Alexander, followed by the breakdown of the kingdom into 4 separate kingdoms? If you know anything about the story of Alexander the Great and the aftermath, this is a direct reference to what has been known, what is called the War of the Successors, or the War of the Diadochi, I think it's pronounced, depending on the English pronunciation or the American pronunciation. The wars of the Diadochi or Diadochi are the wars of the successors of Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great, this is taken straight off just a simple website called worldhistory.org. There are many places you can go to get the history of it. It's a fascinating story, but it has relevance to us only in its conclusion. After the Alexander's conquests, the story of Alexander the Great is really an extraordinary piece of history, because Alexander conquers all of the existing empires of the time and really unites the world under his banner in a way that hadn't been done, creates the largest empire. All of this is all part of the kingdom of Alexander the Great up until the point of his death. He dies in the year 323 BCE, 10th or 11th of June. There's some discussions to how he died, whether he was poisoned or whether he got sick, unclear. But the apocryphal story goes, when asked who would succeed him, Alexander made a comment about the strongest will succeed him. Obviously not his sons. He doesn't have enough children to succeed him, which answer led to his empire eventually being divided between 4 of his generals. They were not his children, they were his generals: Cassander, Ptolemy, Antigonus, and Seleucus, known as the Diadochi, or the successors. What ensued was a 15 to 20 year series of wars across the entire kingdom. Without getting into all of the details of who was involved in the various, there are lots of different players, and there's lots of intrigue and the fighting against each other. By the time it all settles down, the longtime comrade Cassander would order the execution of Alexander's wife Roxana and Alexander's son by her, and Alexander's mother Olympias, to consolidate his power, and he would become the new king of Macedonia, title he would later lose to Antigonus I. Ptolemy is said to have stolen Alexander's corpse as it was en route to Macedon and spirited it away to Egypt in the hope of securing the prophecy that the land in which he laid to rest would be prosperous and unconquerable, and he would found the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt. Seleucus founded the Seleucid Empire in more or less what is today Persia and Iraq. Seleucus, comprising Mesopotamia, Anatolia, parts of India, would be the last remaining of the Diadochi after the incessant 40 years of war between them. He became known as Seleucus I. And then, of course, there is the 4th, which is Antigonus or Cassander in, so you have Seleucus, Ptolemy, Antigonus, and Cassander are the 4 Diadochi of his successors. Why is that of any relevance to a story in Tanakh? Good question. I'm glad you asked. Because, well, I don't know why it's relevant to any part of Tanakh. It's relevant because it's mentioned here. But we shall see that from a Jewish perspective, the only part of this story that is relevant to Tanakh is, of the 4 kingdoms that emerge, which one of these is the most important for us to identify historically, relevant to the story of the Jewish people.
The Seleucids.
Seleucid.
Seleucus dynasty, Seleucus dynasty, correct? Because eventually that will come to Antiochus. This area here, this patch of brown between the Seleucus dynasty and the Ptolemaic dynasty, between Egypt and Mesopotamia, becomes the battleground of the tug of war between Seleucus and Ptolemaic dynasties later in history. And of course, that becomes the story of Antiochus and the story of Hanukkah. And so for us, this is the ground zero for the tug of war between these two major empires hundreds of years later, right? This is already into the story of Hanukkah, which is 100 and some odd years later. Okay, so up to that point, that's fairly straightforward. Where things get a little bit tricky now, and for us, the most important relevance of this prophecy is what comes next. Because after the division of these four kingdoms, u'ba'acharit malchutam, after that has taken place in a future time, yatem haposhim ya'amod melech az panim. Then a king shall arise who is fierce in countenance and understanding of strategy, mevin chidot, yotzam kocho, with great strength, and he will set his sights against the heavens. And he will, even up unto he will even go against the head, the Am Kedoshim, the peoples, and the Sar, and the heavens, and the Tamid, and the Korban Tamid, and the Mikdash. All of this will fall into his hands. And the big question, of course, is, to whom is this last part of the story referring? Ishchit atzumim va'am kedoshim, who will destroy even the people of saints, the holy people of Israel. To whom is this melech az panim? And what relevance is the prophecy of the time frame alpayim shloshmot? And no surprise to us, this is exactly brings us back to the same debate we had back in chapter 7. In fact, the calculations used to explain the 2300 years here are exactly the same. And so Rashi classically suggests Yetzak Keren Achat, this last kingdom that will emerge eventually to wage war against heaven and against the temple, that is a reference to Malchut Titus Yotzet Mimenu, the kingdom of Titus that will emerge from it, meaning Rome. And so we have Persia, we have the war of the Diadochi after Alexander the Great, and then eventually Rome. So says Rashi. As for the war against the Korban Tamid, says Rashi, that's because at the end of the Second Temple period, one of the things that they did was to eliminate the daily sacrifice from the operation of the temple, and for that he sent Nero Caesar. And so the reference here again to the end of Beit Shein, to the Churban of the Second Temple. And Rashi explicitly identifies this king in the last comment, B'achrit malchutam, kishegia zman shitamu l'shei Yisrael, when the time will come when the wicked of Israel shall be punished, Yamod melech az panim, this brazen king will arise, who? Titus. And so Rashi, like so many other Mefarshim, pretty much almost, I would say, unanimously across the board amongst the classic medieval commentaries, assumes that this vision is about three parts. Persia, which falls to Greece, and Greece eventually falls to Rome as part of the punishment of Israel for their sins, and that will be the condition of the Jewish people until Alpayim Shloshmiot, until this number of 2,300, whatever this number represents. Similarly, Ibn Ezra comments that the four kingdoms will divide up the land of the region of Alexander the Great. We'll get into all those details. He makes one change. He says this Melech Az Panim, which we'll come back to not today, but next week, he identifies as Antiochus. We'll talk about that B'ezrat Hashem next week. He also quotes a tradition from the Gaonim that this Melech Az Panim, who HaKedari or Kidri, referring to, I believe, Muhammad, who was born in the year 594 or 4354, according to the Ibn Ezra. Interesting reference there as well. But For the most part, the Mefarshim are all of the opinion, with the exception of the Ibn Ezra we'll talk about next week, that this Melech Az Panim has something to do with the destruction of the temple, and the Alpayim Shloshmiot vision, which Daniel is told is emet, is true, but is also a mystery, emet, right? But you now have to hide it so it's not clearly identifiable. So our job, of course, is to decipher that which Daniel encodes. That's our job. Our job is to take a look at Tanakh. Daniel encodes it, and our job is to decipher it. That's how the Mefarshim operate. So this is going to lead us to exactly where we were in the previous chapter, with a bunch of different calculations on what these 2,300 years refer to. When do they start, and when do they end? And we're going to be in almost the exact same conversation we were back before Pesach. It's going to sound like a little bit of deja vu. So we're going to start, and remember when we went through this the first time in chapter 7, we went through Sadigan, we went through Rashi, we went through Abarbanel, we went through the Malbim, and we went through the sequence amongst all of the classic Mefarshim. We're going to do the same thing. With Sadigan's comment or interpretation is brought down in a few places. It's brought down in Rashi, it's brought down in the Ibn Ezra. This is the simplest place where I found it, which is in the Ibn Ezra. The first thing we need to understand is that these 2,300 are years. And then we need to know where they start from. Utchilatam migalut Mitzrayim. And they start with the Exodus from Egypt. Sorry, that's my translation, and it's incorrect. They start with the exile to Egypt. Migalut Mitzrayim. So that word is incorrect. I tried to translate this freestyle, and I made a mistake. Ibn Ezra says, I don't understand. Why would you start from there? Why would you start from the exile to Egypt? And what does Erev Boker mean in that context? And the time frame that this calculation comes to, Kvar Moed, is already passed. Years ago, Shanim Rabot. So Ibn Ezra says this can't be right. But that is, in fact, Absadigon's interpretation, that the 2,300 is exactly 2,300 from Galut Mitzrayim, from the exile to Egypt, which takes us from the year 2448 plus 2,300 to the year 4748 in the Hebrew calendar, with the year 988 in the CE in the secular calendar, which is exactly, if you remember, I didn't pull it up, but if you remember the source pages we had from the chapter 7, that was the same calculation, right? It's exactly the same calculation. These are this is your chronology chart of Tanakh. Abraham was born in the year 1948 from creation, birth of Yitzchak the year 2048, 100 years later, Exodus, the Exodus is 400 years later, is 2448. Sorry, I was correct the first time. This is calculated from Yetziat Mitzrayim, not from Galut Mitzrayim. Okay. The first temple is 480 years later in the year 2928. The first temple is destroyed 410 years later in 3338. The second temple begins in 3408, 70 years later. The second temple is destroyed, according to Seder Olam, 420 years later in the year 3828, or the year 68 of the Common Era. So those are the numbers that the Rishonim use. Despite how they interpret Tanakh, the Rishonim all use the same numbers. Okay, without getting into the accuracy of the numbers historically, not our issue for now. We're dealing with text interpretation. These are the numbers that the Rishonim use. So Sadigan says 2448 is Yetziat Mitzrayim. Add 2,300 years to that, because that's Erev Boker Alpayim Shloshma 2,300. You get 4748, or the year 988 in the Common Era. And says of Sadigan, that's when the time frame is up for the duration of this Roman conquest, destruction of the temple. Of course, Ibn Ezra says it doesn't make any sense because Ibn Ezra lived many years later, and that year has come and gone, and nothing has happened. So that interpretation cannot be correct. And as we saw when we went through this calculation in chapter 7, every time the Rishonim go, they offer a date, and the date passes, the attitude is, oh, the calculation must be wrong. Rashi says this explicitly. Rashi also is dealing with, and remember, this calculation has to dovetail with the calculation they used back in chapter 7, which was about the time and the time and a half. Remember that whole story? Time and a half, 2 times, 3 times, all those numbers. So Rashi quotes the same issue, and he comes to the same problem. He says, Ad Erev Boker Alpayim Shlosh Meot, says Rashi, Erev and Boker, in order to them to make any sense, have to be a gematria. They have to be encoded numerically. Why does Rashi assume that? He says for 2 reasons. Number one, because this cheshbon has to match the calculations that appear at the end of the book of Daniel. Daniel, at the end of the book, has 2 additional numbers. Remember what they were? One was 1290, and the other is 1335. At the very end of, I'll just show you the 2 texts. The very end of Perek Yud Bet. There, the pasuk says, "Ume'etu sar hatamid," the time that the burnt offering ceases. And the detestable thing is put upon the altar. From that point, the end of the burnt offering, meaning 6 years, Rashi says, before the destruction of the temple, Yamim 1290 will be 1,290 years. Rashi translates this as years. 1290, 1,290 years. Happy is the one who waits for the years 1,335. So in addition to the 2,300, I need to figure out these other 2 numbers, 1290 and 1335. So putting all these numbers together, the only way this makes sense, as Rashi, is to assume that this Erev Boker is in fact a further code of a gematria. And secondly, Gavriel himself says to Daniel that this is a vision that is true, but also hidden. It's a code. So what's the most common code in Tanakh? Gematria. Okay. So therefore, Erev Boker in Gematria, what, anybody want to do a quick calculation? How much is Erev Boker in Gematria? No.
574.
There it is. Gematria 574, 574. Correct. Excellent. Very good. And you did a little math. You did the math, which is good. Add that to the 2,300, and you get 2,874. Okay, remember that number. Then we have B'nitzdak Kodesh. After that, the Holy One shall be exonerated. The iniquity of Israel shall be expiated to bring about an end to the decrees of their being trodden upon and crumbled, since they were in exile, in the first exile to Egypt, until they will be redeemed and saved with the perpetual salvation by a king Mashiach. And his computation terminates at the end of 1,290 years from the daily sacrifice being removed, which is what it says at the end of the book. So let's work through the numbers. Menachzor al Rishonot, says Rashi. How do these numbers work? Well, it's very simple. Here you have it. 210 years they're in Egypt. 480 years, it says, from the time they left Egypt until the temple is built. First temple stood for 410 years. Second temple stood for 420 years. 70-year exile in between them. Then add 1,290 to the end of days, except you have to subtract 6 years because the daily offering was removed 6 years before the destruction. And add the 2,300 and the 574, and you have it all together. Okay, so let's simplify this to very simple. We're going to start from Golut Mitzrayim, from going down to Egypt. There are 210 years in Egypt, 480 years till they leave Egypt, till they build the first temple. 410 years till they build the standing of the first temple. 70 years in exile. 420 years the life of the second temple. Then I add the reference to the end of the book of Daniel, 1290 years from the time that the carbon tamid ceases 6 years before the destruction of the temple. I get to 512. Add 45 years, that last verse, Ashrei HaMechakeh, happy is the one who waits. I get to 5157. 5157 corresponds to the English year 1397. Rashi says you get to the same place by this magical number 2300 plus Erev Boker. Because if you start at 2238, which is Galut Mitzrayim, and you add the 2300 for Erev Boker, right? That's the number here, plus the coded Erev Boker, the Gematria 574, you're going to end up in the same place, 512, 238, plus 2300 plus 574 is going to end up in exactly the same place in the year 5112. You can see it's the same number. These two numbers together, 2300 plus 574, is exactly the same as all these numbers here together. 210 plus 480 plus 410 plus 70 plus 420 plus 1290 minus 6 is 2874. 2300 plus 574, these numbers here, exactly the same number. Rashi just calculates it from two different directions. He says the number here, 2300 plus Erev Boker Gematria, is exactly the same number as calculating the number of years from Galut Mitzrayim until the time of the temple is, the time of the carbon tamid is removed in the 1290 that I mentioned at the end of the book. Does everybody understand this calculation? Right. This is very strict. This is a repeat of what we saw in the previous chapter. It's just Rashi brings it up here again because the Alpaim Shloshmot is the critical number here, but you have to add 574, and you end up in exactly the same calculation as we have been working all along. According to Rashi, Mashiach will come by the year 1397 of the English calendar. Of course, the problem for us is that the year 1397 has come and gone. And so we're left in the same quandary position that we were in when we looked at chapter 7. Is everybody with me? I hope I haven't gone too fast or confused everybody. This is all build up to where our conclusion is going to go. So if you're following it, great. If you're not, it's okay. We're going to get to a conclusion in a second. So that brings us to the Abarbanel. Quotes two other commentaries, one of the Rabbi and one of the Ramban, who is bothered by the fact that these calculations have all come and gone. Sadia's calculation has come and gone. Rashi's calculation has come and gone. Something's amiss. And the answer usually lies in a later starting point for the 2300 missing years, right? So if 2300 is a magical number, then we need to work through. So Abarbanel suggests, first he quotes two other opinions. The Rabbi, who says that the Tchilata Mispar, this I don't have a translation for, so I'm just going to translate as I read it. The Tchilata Mispar, the beginning of the number, is Mimei Shmuel. If you start from the days of Shmuel and you add 2300, you're going to get to sometime in the middle of the 15th century. That was the beginning of the reign of Israel. The Ramban says that he made the beginning of the calculations, the beginning of David's kingdom, because that is the beginning of the reign of Malchut Beit David, which Mashiach is a descendant of. Says the Abarbanel, it's a very powerful line, there's no need to challenge them, because history has proven them false. The calculated number that each one offered has passed. And we're still in exile. So clearly that can't be right. So therefore the Abarbanel says, the beginning of this number, this 2300, and by the way, with the exception of Rashi, they all assume 2300 is 2300, not 2300 plus Gematria, Erev Boker, 574, etc. Just 2300. Beginning of this 2300 mysterious number is from Chiluk HaMalchuyot Asher Achar Yemot Shlomo. It starts from the day the kingdom splits apart. The logic of the Abarbanel's explanation is extraordinary. It says if you want to sweep through history from the moment where the beginning of the end starts when the kingdom splits into two. When the kingdom splits after Shlomo HaMelech into northern and southern kingdoms, that spells the beginning of the end. It'll take several hundred years to reach it, but that's the beginning of the end. We can only be as strong as we are a single kingdom. Enough said. Ki az met shalom ve'ashlemut min benehem. Once their kingdom was split, death, the peace and whole and completeness died with it. Ve'az haya erev Yisrael. That was the beginning of the erev, the long night. Gam chashecha, darkness. Yasher chalak lehem libam nashamu. When they were divided up, they were destroyed. The Gam Babay Cheni, even the Second Temple period, didn't have any greater light associated with it. Lora or amiti. It was always mixed with conflict and tension, etc. So it was also a long extension of the night of exile. Kacha heshiva pidarko ad erev boker 2,300 ותונו לומר, הנה יתמיד זה כל זמן הערב עד שיבוא בוקר. This will be the condition of us, 2,300 years of nighttime, of darkness, until the morning dawn of redemption shall come. Until from the time that we were divided, until we will be reunited under one kingdom united, 2,300 years later. And then Yitzhak Kodesh. Then we will be united. Then we'll be victorious. Okay, so how do you get to the year of the split of the kingdom? So that's not hard to figure out, because, again, working with our same numbers, Yetziat Mitzrayim was in the year 2448. Yes, that's back to, that's our starting point. 2448, go back to here, 2448, you see Yetziat Mitzrayim. Everything starts there. Yetziat Mitzrayim is in the year 2448. Then we have another reference point, which is the temple is built. This is a pasuk in Sefer Malachim Aleph Perek Vav. The temple is built 480 years after Yetziat Mitzrayim. So if the temple is built 480 years after Yetziat Mitzrayim, that's the 4th year of Shlomo HaMelech. B'shnat Arba L'Malchuto. And he reigns for 40 years. So if I add how many years after the temple is built is Shlomo on the throne, 36. 40 minus the 4 before the temple was built. And so he says, take the 2448, add to it the 480 years of first temple, until the first temple was built, add to it the 36 years of Shlomo's reign after he built the temple, and the year the temple was, the year the kingdom was divided comes to the year 2964. Add to that the Erev Boker 2,300, and then he says you have to have 1 year for overlapping, because a lot of this overlaps. Right? The temple is built in the 4th year, and then there's 40 years in total. So you always have to add that +1, right? So you add the 1, and what do you get? 2964 plus 2,300 minus 1. You end up with 5263, which is the year in the common era of 1503. Anybody remember what year the Abarbanel said Mashiach was destined to come when he calculated based on the time and a half nevuah we had on the previous parak? I'll give you a guess. Trying to guess?
1508.
1503? Right?
The same.
It has to be, because the whole point here is that all the prophecies have to end up in the same place, says the Rishon. Okay. Of course, 1503 is only a handful of years after the expulsion from Spain in the year 1492. Abravanel doesn't live to see it, and 1503 has come and gone. So that brings us to the last of our calculations for today, which is the Malbim. And in these source pages, I've given you sort of the shorthand at the top. The Malbim writes the following. Ad Erev Boker Alpayim Shloshmot. The Malbim is most interesting for us, and we're gonna redo all of this next week. But the Malbim is most interesting for us. 2300. Azman Ad Sheyeh Erev Dahainu Ad HaChurban Sheyavo Yedei Aramim. This is until the time of the Churban brought about by the Romans. Ad Sheyesh Shenit Boker, until there'll be another morning dawn. Tegula Atidah. This will be 2,300 years. As Nitzta Kodesh, then the temple will be victorious. Mine im nachshav zman ze be'et hachurban harishon. If we calculate from the time of the first destruction of the first temple, which was in the year 3338, so not from the Exodus and not from the exile, but from the destruction of the first temple, and I add 2,300 to that number, I'll get 5638, which is the year 1878. However, again, the Malbim is writing after that time. It doesn't say that this time is going to start from the destruction of the first temple. So therefore, the Malbim says, let's do something a little different. We're talking about a conversation between the Malach and Daniel. The Malach says to Daniel, 2,300. From when? From yesterday, from the day before, 2,300 from the destruction of the first temple, 2,300 from some victorious, right? 2,300 from when? Says the Malbim, 2,300 from then. 2,300 years from the day the conversation was taking place between Daniel and the Malach, which was Mishnat Gimel Belshazzar, which is 50 years after the destruction of the temple, because we're 20 years away from the end of the 70-year exile. So that means that we have to start from the year 3388, 50 years later. And if I take 3388 and I add 2,300 to it, I end up in the year 5688, which is the year 1928. However, that times and time and a half, that came to a different calculation, 1913. That came to 15 years earlier. So now I have two numbers, and the Malbim says they don't mix, they don't shtim. Says the Malbim, it's because sheminas hefsek mamshelet hakeren zeira shebo diber lemala ad binyan hamikdash v'haklavat hatamid shebo diber kan yitarech 15 shana. It'll be 15 years between the time that the destruction of the Roman Empire and the allowance, the beginning of the redemption of Israel shall start until the temple is built. That'll be 15 years. How do I know it'll be 15 years? Because Chazal talk about a 7-year period of Malchut Beit David and another 7-year period of Gog and Magog. And so you put it together, those are 14 years, and we're now in year 15. And so the two numbers work. 1913 for the beginning of Cheshbon, Edana Danin, time and a half, and 1928 for the 2,300 years from the moment of the conversation with the Malach about the restoration of the Korban Tamid. Says the Malbim, that's the number. And there's your brief summary. If Sadigan says the Roman Empire and the destruction will be undone by the year 988. Rashi says by the year 1397. Rabbi say sometime by the middle of the 15th century. Abarbanel says by the year 1503. The Malbim says sometime between 1913 and 1928. And they've all gone. Now, I will say one thing about this year 1913, the Malbim's calculation. And I'm going to stop sharing here for a second. I will say one thing about the Malbim's calculation because it's just fascinating to observe. And that is that, anybody know what year World War I began?
1914, wasn't it?
1914, Tisha B'Av 1914. So, and Rav Kook writes that when the nations of the world are at war with each other, there's a kind of a mitorer koach HaMashiach, right? The power of Mashiach comes alive. So World War I is fascinating because it also brought about the collapse of 4 empires, right? The Russian Empire, the Prussian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. So the context of the Malbim's identification of 1913 and 1914 is somehow related to this, just fascinating. In the context, again, we're going to go in a completely different direction next week, but it's just a fascinating little nuance to this whole discussion. And if we're already going there, you know what? I'm going to throw my hat, since everybody else threw their hat in the ring as far as calculations go, I'll throw another one, which is, what if we started the year of the 2300 from the year of the building of the Second Temple? What if the entire calculation of 2300 was from the building of the Second Temple? Anybody remember what year the Second Temple was built?
We don't know.
Well,
Except if you go according to
So-
Seder Olam.
yeah, right. I'm working
Otherwise,
all these
don't
calculations. Correct. All these calculations I'm working off for Seder Olam because that's what the Rishonim did. Next week we'll get much more academic, but for now I'm working off Seder Olam, working off the numbers, just to throw out a little bit of material thought to consider. According to Seder Olam, the Second Temple is built in the year 70 years after the exile, in the year 3408. Correct? Okay, yeah, I'm just throwing it out there. Add 2300 to it, and what do you get?
$57.08.
5708. 5708 in the Hebrew calendar corresponds to what year in the English calendar?
Probably.
That you shouldn't have to worry. That you shouldn't have to think too hard about. 5708 is Tafshin Chet, Tashach, otherwise known as 1948 in English calendar, the year of the birth of the state of Israel. So I just throw that as a calculation. If you want to take Seder Olam and you want to take the number of 3408 and add to it the 2300 years, you may end up in the year 5708 or in something close thereof. I just, since everybody else threw a number into the hat, I might as well. However, we're going to take this all in a very different direction. Because, and I think my eye glanced a couple of comments in the chat, which is all based on one assumption. Everything we've said today is based on one assumption. And that one assumption is, besides the years from Seder Olam, but it's based on the assumption that all the Rishonim take, save one. And that is that the Alpayim Shloshmiot refers to years.
Yes.
And based on that, they're trying to navigate all through this period of history. The only one to suggest that it's not years, but days, is the Ibn Ezra. And the Rishonim, particularly the Barbanel, rails against him for it. Virtually accuses him of being a heretic for it. Why and how that came about and what the controversy around that calculation was, Bezrat Hashem, that's our subject for next week. So we will adjourn here and we will pick up this story, Bezrat Hashem, next week. And I will pause for questions, but before I do, I will pause for station identification, and that is that next week we are, how many, just, you could put into the chat if you're located in Israel, and therefore there's a conflict of schedule for next week, because next week in Israel, this time slot falls into the Arab Yom Ha'atzmaut. So if you can just put into the chat if you're in Israel. If you're not in Israel, don't worry about it. I just need to get a sense of how many people are actually in Israel. And then we'll figure it out. But I'm assuming we're going to have a class on schedule next week. If you can't make it because it's in conflict with what's going on in Israel, that's okay. Israel takes precedence. This will be recorded, and you can always come back to it afterwards and watch the recording. So that is that's the bottom line. Okay, questions?
Thank you very much, Rabbi.
My pleasure. Always a pleasure. Okay.
Yasher koach, Rabbi Shulman.
Baruch Tiyah. Thank you. And hopefully we'll see everybody. We're missing a few people today, but hopefully we'll see everybody by next week.
Thank you.
My pleasure.